welcome to Can You Just Sit With Me? Where I discuss hope in grief, hope in the hard place, and hope during the challenging times of life. I am your host, Natasha Smith. Thanks so much for joining me today. So today I'm so super excited to introduce you to Dorina Lazo Gilmore-Young. I'm super excited to have her with us today, sitting with us. She is an author, speaker, Bible teacher, podcaster, and spoken word artist. And her passion is helping people discover God's glory in unexpected places and to flourish in their God-given callings. Now, she has written a number of books, and you can find her writings also over at Encourage, as well as Proverbs 31. And I'm just so ready and excited to get started and just to chat with her. So, hi, Dorina, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Natasha. I'm so honored to be with you.
I'm so excited for you to be here, and just welcome to you to Can You Just Sit With Me? So I know I shared like a little bit about you. So if you can just take a few minutes and just kind of tell everyone a little bit more about you, that would be awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I am a mama to three girls. So I've got a 10-year-old, 13-year-old, and 16-year-old. We are in the throes of raising kids, and I'm a remarried widow. So my husband is Sean. He and I have been married almost 7 years now. We live in Central California, and I love running. I love cooking. I love travel, and I'm madly in love with God's word. I love to teach God's word. I love to study God's word. And really, it's my therapy too. It's a place I go when times are hard, when circumstances are challenging.
Oh, I love that so much. And I know all of that spills over into your teaching and your speaking, and so today I'm really interested in just hearing from you and everyone who will be listening what you have to say on loss and grief and your story. As you mentioned, you are a remarried widow, and so if you can just kind of start us there with just some of your grief story as it relates to your loss.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Natasha. So, ironically, this week, 8 years ago, is when I had to make one of the hardest decisions of my life. And that was to invite hospice into our home. My husband, Eric Lee, had been diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma cancer in May of that year. And we never in a million years imagined that cancer would visit our family. We, at the time, were directors of a nonprofit organization in Haiti. So we kind of split our time between the mission field in Haiti and California, where a lot of our supporters were. I was actually running a fair trade jewelry business, so employing artisans in Haiti and providing jobs for women there and mentoring women there, and then helping them sell their goods here in the US. So everything came to kind of a screeching halt for us in May of that year when my husband received this devastating diagnosis, and his health went downhill pretty quickly. So like I mentioned, 8 years ago here in September, this first week of September was our last week together with him. And then September 9th is when he soared to heaven. And so I was suddenly a young widow. I was 37 with 3 kids who were ages 2, 5, and 8. They were just so young, and suddenly navigating a whole new life that I never dreamed of. I actually stepped out of our nonprofit organization because I felt like it was really important for me to spend some time with my kids healing and just be more grounded here in California where our family and our community lived. And that was the beginning of a whole journey of grieving and learning how to navigate grief for myself and for my kids. It was also the beginning of stepping into a calling that God had on my life, which was to be a writer and speaker and to specifically share about his glory that we can find in the midst of grief. And so that's kind of my story in a nutshell. I welcome any other questions about kind of the journey along the way.
Yeah. Um, can you kind of tell us a little bit of, because grief is different for everyone, right? It looks different for everyone. We navigate it differently. So can you just describe a little bit how, like how would you describe grief?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question. And this is something I'm really passionate about whenever I speak or even when I'm writing, is that every grief journey is unique because we're unique people. God designed us in different ways. We all have different personalities and different ways that we process things. And so I would say, kind of a definition of grief is just that it's a sadness, it's a mourning of something that we have lost, whether it's a person or a job or a community, especially through the last several years through the pandemic. So many people have experienced loss and grief in different ways, not just death of family members, but also losses within their families of, maybe a business or even our health. And so that I think really is what grief is about. It's trying to process that loss. But for me specifically, grief has looked different ways. And I've discovered that grief oftentimes is dancing with joy. And so some days it means there are both tears and laughter in my home and in my heart, even within an hour, that I could be crying over the loss of my husband, but also experiencing the joy and laughter of being with his children, with my children, And I think grief is one of my favorite analogies is that grief is kind of like a tangled ball of yarn. I love to knit and my kids like to crochet, and that's just like a calming, fun activity I've done since I was in college. And so I think about this tangled ball of yarn. And so some days that yarn is just rolling along easy, unraveling, and it's not difficult. And then other days you come up on a knot or you come up on a tangle, and it means you have to stop and you have to spend some time with that yarn to untangle it and unravel it. And that's so much how grief is too. There's some days where I can just kind of soar through, and there are other days where I have to be more deliberate to take time to allow myself to process, to pray, maybe even to lament and worship. So that's what it looks like for me. And then I've discovered as a mom of 3 very unique, different girls that it's different for each one of them as well.
Yeah. I love that analogy so much. For one, because I crochet.
Okay.
I totally get that. And those knots are so annoying, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, you're trying to finish a project or working through a project and you have to stop. You
Yes.
have to stop and you have to, maneuver and try to get that knot out or something. That's such a great analogy. And that's how it kind of is with grief. It's like, I don't feel like interrupting my day because of this, but sometimes we have to stop and we have to make space for it.
Mm.
Wow, that is so good. And so that kind of um it kind of moves me to this next question of, and you kind of answered it some, like how, like describing maybe the days and the months after this loss. Because one thing I like to as I'm speaking with guests is just kind of so people can get an idea that grief is normal, and
Mm-hmm.
some days are messy. So I like to ask this question so people can get real answers of how grief, what it can look like in those first days, first months, or even years. So if you can kind of tell us a little bit, like how did those first days, and then fast forward a few months, and then even years, and like you said, this will be like 8 years on the ninth. Like how does all this feel now?
Hmm. Yeah, just bearing in mind that everybody's journey is different.
Yeah.
But for
Yeah.
me, those first few months, especially, were what I would call like the really intense grief and
Mhm.
feeling that absence, that loss of my husband, my partner, my, we worked together too, because we were working in this nonprofit organization. So we made decisions together. We prayed together regularly. Like all of that was gone. My co-parent, making decisions about my kids and going to the teacher conferences and those types of things that I always did with my husband. I worked out together with him. He was my running buddy and my coach. So I know not everyone has the same type of relationships with their husband, but for me, it was really intense feeling his absence, and especially because my kids were so young. And I would say probably the first year for me, I was in that intensity of grief, of just trying to recalibrate and figure out, how am I going to do this life without, the man I was married to for 11 years? How am I going to pivot on so many dreams that I felt like were dying or had died with him? And how am I going to really pursue what God wants for me, as a model for my kids too? I was just grappling with all of that in that first year. I would say that the greatest gift that God gave me in that first year was the power of community. Mm-hmm. And I like to say, I've written an article about this before. I like to say that my late husband, Eric Lee, invested in community life insurance, in the sense of like, his life was dedicated to community. He was a coach, he was a teacher, he was a missionary, he was a mentor. And so he invested in so many people's lives. And so after he went to heaven, that investment was something actually that his daughters and I got to reap the benefits of, because so many people that he had invested in circled back and, provided for our family in various ways, whether that was like coming over and fixing my car, or helping clean my house, or driving my kids to school, like real practical ways that they helped to serve us. We had people from all over the world who had prayed through that season for us. We had a pretty large amount of medical bills that needed to be paid. And so in that season, I was absolutely blown away by the way that people provided for us financially and helping us with those bills. So many things. So I got to have that sense of like provision and joy at the same time as experiencing that really deep grief of him being gone. And that was especially in the early days. And then I would say in the years to follow, the grief doesn't go away. And I wish I had better news. I wish I could say like, oh, you do these 5 things and then it goes away or it gets better. That's not always true for everyone. And sometimes it goes in cycles. I've talked to widow friends who say, oh, year 2 is actually harder than year 1. For me, it's just kind of changed over time. There's still sadness in my heart, but also there is what I'll say kind of a moving forward with my life. It doesn't mean that I've forgot about my husband. He's so present with us in our daily lives, but by God's grace, he brought a new husband into my life. And Sean and I got married a couple of years after my husband went to heaven. Sean was one of my late husband's best friends. And so he was a very close family friend. He had supported us in our ministry. He knew my parents and my in-laws, and him coming into our life was such a blessing because he already knew my late husband. So he was grieving alongside us, and he was also joining our family. And I love the way that he so gently just loved on my kids and told them stories about their dad and honored their dad. It was a very unique situation. So even though we were kind of figuring out like how to be a new couple, how to be married, him being a father for the first time, not that any of that stuff was easy. There was what I would call like this beautiful synergy of God bringing together our lives, because he had already been a part of our lives, and there was healing even in that. Mm-hmm. So that's some of the ways that it's kind of changed along the way. And then even you were asking about, now 2022, 8 years later, I'll just be vulnerable and say, even this weekend, I could feel in my body like the heaviness of this week, because I knew that I had to make that decision 8 years ago. And really, it was inviting hospice into our home, as I mentioned at the beginning. And it was I started to pray as his wife for God to take him, because I didn't want to see him suffer anymore. And it's a prayer that when you're at the altar, you never imagine praying. You say in sickness and health in those vows, but you're not thinking about sickness, right? You're thinking about health. And so it was really hard. And I still feel that kind of trigger in my spirit every year, this time of year, that sadness. But I'll also share just one thing that we do every year. So we're going to do it again this year, is we host a heaven anniversary party at our home. And I did this the first year, and now it's like one of our favorite things we do all year, that we invite friends over for dinner. And a lot of times I'll invite friends that maybe we don't see every day, that were part of my husband's life in different ways, maybe went to school with him or lived with him or were part of youth group or his former students. Every year it's kind of a different mix. And I invite them over, we have dinner with them, and then we just tell stories. We invite them to tell stories about my husband, and my kids love it because they get to experience their daddy's legacy through the eyes of other people. So that's something that is really meaningful that we do every year as a remembrance of him. And even though you would think, oh, that's going to be a sad event, honestly, it's more laughter and more love than it is like tears and mourning, because it's being together in that community that loved him.
Oh, I love that so much. So much. It it just had me thinking of so many different things. I love what you said about the gift and power of community. Um, because I've just found so much healing just in the last few years in community, and I wouldn't have never thought it, because I was one of those ones was like, no, I don't want to be around people. Like people aren't safe, that type of mindset. But oh my God, God made us for it. And so I love what you said about the gift and power of community, and then just how, like, the law of reciprocity, your late husband sowed into so much community, and then how it just came right back around and bless you guys so much. Um, and then again, just hosting and remembering him. I want to talk about that just a little bit. Like you say, you do this each year. For one, it builds community, which is awesome. But when you were saying how, you thought it would be like a sad event, I think a lot of times as grievers, that's what we like. I feel like, oh, you know, I may try to avoid something or not do something because it may make me feel sad, but in actuality, it's making space to honor and to remember. So I love this event. Um, what what kind of made you think? How did you come up with it? I guess.
Yeah, I love the way that you articulated that too, that we need to make that space for grief. And it's not about avoiding sadness. I will be honest and say, my personality, if anybody's familiar with the Enneagram, my personality is a 7, which means I'm an enthusiast. I love a good party. I love sharing meals with people. And my nature is to avoid pain. And, if anything, as I was praying and thinking about, well, how could we celebrate my husband's life? How could we sort of reframe what September 9th meant to us, that it's not just this day of intense sadness, but it's also a celebration that he is enjoying eternity with Jesus, that, he gets to have a new body in heaven. Like, even processing that with my girls in the early years, like, daddy doesn't have this tumor on his hip anymore. Like, he doesn't have this cancer in his body, because his body is with Jesus and it's brand new. And that's something to celebrate. And it was like, I wanted my girls to look forward to heaven. So having the dinner party in some ways kind of came naturally, because I am a foodie. I love to, like, host people. For other people in my life, just for as an example, his mom, my mother-in-law, who I love dearly, and she is a people person, but that is absolutely not what she wants to do on September 9th. She wants to have time to herself. She wants to go to the cemetery. She doesn't want to grieve with other people. And I've learned that that's not my place to judge. It's just that she has a little bit different personality. And so for me, it's okay to enjoy what we've created. And I've seen even how my kids have taken ownership of it. The last couple of years, it's been really fun because they were like, okay, we're going to help you with the menu, Mom. We're going to help you with the cooking. And, even this year, like the last couple of months, we've been talking about like, who are we going to invite? Because there are some of our core people, of course, that we invite every year, but then there are different people that we invite who we don't see all the time, or who my kids don't even really know in their everyday lives, but maybe we're like my husband's roommate, or somebody who played sports with him, or one of his students, where it's just this fun opportunity to hear like, oh, this is how daddy influenced this person's life. And so that's kind of how it came to be. And even the word heaven anniversary, like I just kind of made that up because I was like, well, this is an anniversary of his death day. But for us, we're celebrating that it's an anniversary of him going to heaven.
Yeah. I love it so much. So I guess even moving from that, or moving into, where do you find hope? I have an idea, but just
Well,
share where have you found hope in all of this?
one of the things that I write about a lot and that I love to share with people is this idea of chasing God's glory. And so my hope in my daily life and in, like the vision and heart of my life is that I would be an arrow pointing people to God's glory. And how I do that in really practical ways is that every day I open my eyes and I'm like looking for God's glory, and I'm talking to my kids about it, and my friends and my husband, Sean, now, where do we see God showing up? Where do we see God working? For example, I love to run. Running has been one of my like therapeutic things that I've done through the years that have helped me with my grief. And when I'm running, I love to run outside, and I love God's creation. So whether it's a sunrise or a sunset that's painted across the sky, or just the delicate petals of a flower that I might run by, or this majestic tree that's pointing towards heaven, like all of those things to me are evidence of God's glory. They're evidence of him at work, evidence of his redemption that happens. I also see his glory in conversations that I have with my kids. I see his glory even in the midst of grief. Like I talked about before, the community, the provision that God had for us, like that was evidence that our God cares about us. Yeah. And so when we start to number those things, when we start to notice those things, maybe even jot them down in a journal or talk about them around the dinner table, that's where hope emerges from grief. And whenever I feel myself getting to a dark place, it's not that I don't want to have sadness. And you touched on that before. I think really important for us to allow ourselves to be sad and to cry and to lament, like, God, this isn't fair, or these are the questions I have for you, God. Those things are really important. But I also recognize that he doesn't want us to sit in darkness. And so whenever I feel like I'm in darkness or maybe slipping into a depression, chasing his glory, looking for his hope is the way that I pull myself from that.
Yes. That is so awesome. And is that the name of your children's book?
Yes, I do have a children's book actually coming out in April that's called Chasing God's Glory. Mm-hmm. And it really is that same concept. It's a little girl who's going on a bike ride with her mom. And so they are riding all throughout their city, and her mom is kind of teaching her how to chase God's glory. And there's a little element of grief in there too, because the little girl's daddy has died. And so they're remembering him. And she's even kind of showing her like, hey, there's glory in this. Like the living of dad's legacy is also glory. So I originally wrote a Bible study called Glory Chasers that came out about a year after my husband's death. And then a friend of mine who is also a children's writer said, Dorina, you should write a children's book about this. And I was like, okay, I don't know what that would look like. But I sat down and I was like, okay, this is kind of what came out. So I'm super excited about that releasing in spring of 23.
Oh, I love that. I'm excited about that too. And just the concept of the book, as well as just how you found hope in chasing after God's glory and looking for him in everything. It just it just reminds me of, just this thought of like, when you're surrounded by darkness and, God is, Jesus is the light, if we can
Mhm.
just look for that glimmer, no matter how dark it feels, or, you know, if we're, because day to day can be interesting when it comes to grief, right?
Mhm.
You can just be going along and it's like, oh, everything's good, da, da, da. And then something, you're triggered by something, or because even for me, like during the fall, it can be an interesting season, fall
Mhm.
time, because I've experienced a lot of loss during the fall season, as well
Mhm.
as when it gets around like hurricane season in my
Mhm.
area.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so I have to kind of, like you're saying, chase God's glory. Like I have to be intentional to
Yeah.
not just like slip into, I'm sad, and it's okay again to feel sadness, but I can't just allow it to consume me, because
Mhm.
God is
That's a
just
good
so
way to
good.
say
He's
it.
just so good. I have to look for the glimmer of light and say, okay, yeah, God is here. He's caring for me. He knows me. He's
Mhm.
there. So I love that, just the idea of just chasing God's glory.
Mm.
Just so good. And so, in speaking of, so you have the children's book that's coming out, Chasing God's Glory. Um, I have a question that'll kind of lead into your another project that you have coming as well, which
Yeah.
is, how has this informed your work? So how has, you know, this your story, and I love how you mentioned at the beginning that, loss is not just the loss of a loved one, but it we experience loss in all kinds of different ways, right? But how has this particular loss, and any many losses that you've experienced, how does that kind of inform your work and what you've been doing, and what future things that you have going on?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Natasha. Definitely the grief journey and the chasing God's glory are a thread throughout everything I do. And so, whether I'm speaking for a group at a conference, or I'm writing a book, or like the children's book, which is a little bit different genre, I can't help it. That's the message that God has given me. And I'll be honest, back in 2015, like a year after my husband's death, I realized that this was a message that God gave me, but I was a bit resistant to it because I was like, I don't want to be the grief lady. Like, I was crying out to God. And I've been a writer since I was a kid. Like, I've written in a lot of different ways. I was a newspaper reporter. I worked in the nonprofit space, like I mentioned before. And then I really felt like God was calling me to the nonfiction space. And I started writing for Encourage, like you mentioned in my bio. So I write a lot of devotionals, and I was like just really trying to seek, like, Lord, what is it that you want me to share? What is my message? And I felt like he was showing me, I want you to be the glory lady. I don't want you to be the grief lady. I want you to be the glory lady. And the way that I've wired you is that I mentioned I'm an enthusiast, I'm an influencer. Like, that's just the person that he made me. And joy is kind of my superpower. Like, it's just something that comes naturally. And he's like, that doesn't come naturally to everyone. I want you to show people how to go there. I want you to show people how to chase after that. And it was through some different mentors and coaches and different people in my life who kind of spoke those similar words over me in that season that I started writing about my grief journey, mostly on my blog, but then in other publications, Encourage, even Proverbs 31 Ministries. I have a devotional coming out this month that's about my grief journey. And I realized that it was something that was resonating because so many people have experienced loss in different ways, like we've been talking about. And so that's really something that touches every aspect of what I do. And you mentioned another project. So I'm just in the midst of doing final edits for a new book that is going to be coming out in the fall of 23, which is a little more creative nonfiction. It's a journal. So it includes devotions, 25 devotions, reflections from my own grief journey to encourage the person who is walking through grief and loss. And then there's space for them to write about their journey, to process some questions that I include. And, there's prayers and quotes. So it's really an invitation for people to go and carve out that space like we've been talking about. So I wanted to write a book that wasn't just like, oh, here's my story of loss, because honestly, there's so many of those books out there. Not that they're bad, but it's just like overwhelming in some ways. I wanted to be more of like what you might call like a grief guide. Like I wanted to help guide people on their own journey. And so I use a little bit of my own story as the narrative, but really the invitation is for people to enter into their own grief journey and really pointing them back to God's glory.
Mm-hmm. I love that so much. I'm like, I can't wait.
I know. It's really honestly the book that so many people have asked me about. It's like, do you have anything that I could give to my friend who just lost her husband, or, who just lost her mom? I've had that question so many times through the DMs and through people in my real life. And so actually this publisher came to me and said, would you like to write this book? And I'm like, okay, I don't even have to think about that. Like it's already on my heart. I already know exactly what God would have me put in it. So I was so privileged to just, be invited to write it by Ink and Willow, which is part of the Penguin Random House group.
Mm-hmm. I'm excited for that one. I'm excited. So excited. So needed. And so what other resources like have you that have personally like helped you along your journey?
Oh, that's so good. I'm a reader, so I love books. Books are like my companions that help me. I'll mention a couple of them. One of them is I think it's called A Grief Disguise, or let me think.
A disguised grief. Is that it?
It's by Jerry Sitzer.
Yes.
And you know what? I actually have on my website, if anybody's interested in this, I have a list of books about grief that have influenced my life. And so if you hop over to DorinaGilmore.com, you can sign up for my newsletter, and I will give you access to my library where you can just get the whole list. But it's called A Grace Disguised by Jerry Sitzer. And that's one of the books. It was really crazy. Like, this is just God's timing. In the months where my husband was like, he had his cancer, I was part of MOPS International. I was a coordinator for its Mothers of Preschoolers at my church. And I was the leader of the group. And we were like scheduled to go to this conference, like a one-day conference that was a few hours away. There was like pretty much nothing else that I could do in my life because I was taking care of my husband. But my husband's best friend had come and said, hey, we want you to be able to go on this conference. Like, I'm going to get some of the guys together. We're going to spend the day with your husband. We want you to go. Well, long story short is Jerry Sitzer was the speaker at that conference. And I mean, still it could make me cry because I felt like God just orchestrated that for me, that he came, he gave his testimony. Actually, I think it's his wife and his mother and one of his children who died in a car accident. And he was there to train MOPS leaders on how to serve women in crisis. But here I was, the leader of the group, and like all these women were learning how to like just walk through this trauma with me. And so that book, I read the book later after my husband went to heaven, but that book has always been really special to me because I did get to hear Jerry live and like his testimony during that conference. And that was even like a month before my husband went to heaven. So that is one of the books that I love. A couple of recent books. A good friend of mine, Lisa Appelo, wrote a book that's called Life Can Be Good Again. And that just came out last year. And that's another one that's great. That's a little bit more recent, especially for like if you have different kinds of losses. She is a widow, but if you are experiencing different types of losses, that's another one. And the last one I'll mention is it's by my friend Danita Janae, who writes for Moody Publishers. And her book, I'm trying to get the name of it real quick here. When Mountains Crumble is the name of her book. And her book is kind of interesting because it has some questions and prompts also that you can kind of answer if you're going through your own grief journey. So those are three that have made an impact. Honestly, I could sit here and talk about like 20 different books that have changed me. because I love books so much. But those are some of the resources. And then I've developed some resources too. So again, if people are interested, on my website, there's YouTube talks that I've done, Bible studies, and a bunch of writing about my journey that I love to be able to serve you through that.
Yes. Yes. And I'll be sure to include all of your info in the description box. So they'll have all the ways to connect with you and to get all of those resources.
Thank you.
And so I'd like to ask, as we kind of close or wrap up, what would you like to leave like the listeners with, like some type of encouragement for their hearts today?
Well, this is something that, I've mentioned before in the interview, but I want people to understand that every grief journey is unique, and we all are either on a grief journey or we're going to be on one. And those words might not sound encouraging right now, but I feel like for me, especially after my husband went to heaven, I needed to understand that what I was going through was normal and it's part of the human experience. And so depending on how you're wired, you may want to run away from grief. You may want to push it down or to isolate yourself. But for us, the only way through grief is through. And so what that means is that we need to make that space and make it normal for others too. Like as a mom, I realized, okay, I don't really know how to help my kids in their grief, but I needed to make it normal in my house and safe at my table for them to cry and ask questions and all those things. And so that would be my encouragement to people today.
I love that. Normal, allow it, make it safe. All those is so, so important in this community and to anyone who is grieving. And I know I mentioned that I'll leave all your information, but how can listeners connect with you?
Probably the best way is through my website, DorinaGilmore.com. And I'm on social media. Instagram is my happy place. I post there almost every day. But if you're interested in any of my other resources or my newsletter, you can hop over to my website. I would love to connect with you personally, especially if you're on a grief journey.
Yeah. Oh, this has been so amazing. I'm so excited to just have spent this time with you. And I know the listeners will just going to have so much to glean, and I know that they will be connecting with you everywhere and to grab all of your your resources and your knowledge. And so I just thank you again for sitting with me. I just appreciate you so much, and for all the work that you're doing as well.
Thank you, Natasha. I am so grateful for the invitation.
That brings me to the end of this episode. Thanks again for joining me, and thanks for listening to Can You Just Sit With Me? If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to come back for my next episode of Can You Just Sit With Me? Until then, this is Natasha Smith, helping you to find hope in grief, hope in the hard place, and hope in the challenging times of life. Be sure to connect with me across social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at I'm Natasha Smith.